otherwise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and in today's episode, I'm pleased to be joined by Mark Srere. Mark is the leader of the White-Collar Defense and Investigation and Securities Enforcement and Litigation Client Service Group at Bryan Cave. A substantial portion of Mark's practice is devoted to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure speaking with you today.
Now, there's a lot going on, obviously, in the FCPA enforcement landscape. If you were in charge of FCPA enforcement at the DOJ or SEC, would you make any changes to the current FCPA enforcement environment? And if so, what changes might you suggest?
So, Mike, the short answer to the question is yes. But before I talk about what I might do, let's talk about why I think there ought to be some changes and why the government ought to make some changes, and it's in their interest as well. I think we can all agree that the best enforcement program will always have a carrot and a stick approach. You know, you've got to give some positive reason to step forward, and you also have to have some negative consequences for violations of the law. And the current DOJ and SEC programs have both elements. There are carrots and there are sticks. And I think that they would tell you, hey, we've got it right. You know, we've balanced those carrots and sticks appropriately because just look at this year. Already they have more corporate settlements than ever before, for example. And so they're naturally going to think they've got the balance right. But I fall into the category of lawyers who work in this area who disagree. I think that the carrot they're offering is neither big enough nor certain enough to ensure that good companies that have good compliance programs will voluntarily disclose or necessarily even should voluntarily disclose. Right now, I think the government's approach is simply too punitive and still too uncertain. And Mike, I think you probably are part of that group as well because, I've read your excellent article regarding arguing for an FCPA compliance defense to be written into the statute that you published in the Wisconsin Law Review a few years back. So I think there are companies out there that will not and probably should not voluntarily disclose under the current program because of the lack of a shiny enough carrot, let's call it that, and the feeling that disclosing could be a lose-lose proposition. And what I mean by a lose-lose proposition is that they know by voluntarily disclosing they're going to have to pay more money and increased investigative costs, and they don't necessarily know whether there's a cap to that. And they may still face an enforcement action. So from that perspective, what have they gained? So,
well, from the standpoint of the DOJ and the SEC to a lesser extent, the DOJ obviously has a relatively new FCPA pilot program. At least they are going to say that you're gaining the possibility of no action through a so-called declination, whatever that means. The DOJ is saying by voluntarily disclosing, you might get a reduction in the penalties under the sentencing guidelines. So at least they're saying that companies that voluntarily disclose are going to get those benefits.
And I think that's fair to the extent that they actually get the no charge, and they do not have to pay their outside law firm more than the 50% reduction in fine, and they walk away with nothing more. And so for some companies, it might be beneficial, but it's still a kind of trust me, it might happen approach. And let's look at the flip side of not disclosing, right? So for the company that doesn't voluntarily disclose, they have a chance that they are never charged. They have a chance to pay no fine, not just the 50% reduction. And they have certainty that as long as the government does not start an investigation, they're not going to have to pay more to the outside law firm or forensic accounting firm that conducted the investigation. So on the non-disclosure side, we've got some pretty good carrots too. And I want to sort of talk about one of the recent settlements to illustrate the point here. In July 2016, just a few months back, they had a settlement with the technology company, the SEC did. And I read through the settlement, and I said, why is the SEC hitting this company with a violation? So let's talk about the facts of that case. It involved a Chinese subsidiary of a company that the settling company acquired. And when it acquired it, the Chinese company subsidiary was already under investigation. And so they did anti-corruption due diligence before acquiring, and they knew what they were getting into. So, check that box. They did the right thing. They quickly upgraded the compliance program. They found the issues, and they quickly remediated the issues. Check that box. They terminated responsible employees and hired a new manager. Okay, check there. They also went as far as to eliminate the use of agents, which was the source of the initial FCPA problem. Check that box. They trained the new employees. Check. They audited. Check. And they eventually detected a new problem. Check. They voluntarily disclosed to the government. Check. They cooperated completely. Check. Okay, so you would think in that situation that they would be somebody who would walk away with nothing. Yet they ended up paying a disgorgement of nearly $12 million and a penalty on top of that of over $1 million. And so, and the disgorgement went back 6 years. And I forgot to mention, on top of that, it took 3 years from voluntarily disclosing to settling. So imagine the additional fees and costs of investigation that this company paid. So what does that settlement tell other companies? Here's a company that did it right. They checked all those boxes, and they still got hammered and had to go through a long process to get resolution. So I think for all these reasons, there needs to be a change, and they need to improve the enforcement carrot that they're handing out. So now I'll get to what do I think they need to do, or what would be a good idea in this situation.
Before we do that, just sort of an observation about what I view as really a troubling facet of particularly SEC enforcement actions, particularly as it relates to the internal control provisions. The SEC, from my perspective, seems to view things, of course, with the perfect benefit of hindsight. And notwithstanding those various checks that the company did in the enforcement action you're referencing, looking at things with the perfect benefit of hindsight and saying, sure, that company did X, Y, and Z, but they could have done it better, but they missed something. I call it, and have called it before, sort of the woulda, shoulda, coulda approach to internal controls, which of course, from my perspective, is completely inconsistent with the actual statutory provision, which says that issuers must have reasonable internal controls to provide adequate assurances, not foolproof. Any comment on or observation regarding what, at least from my perception, is a very typical FCPA enforcement theory, particularly by the SEC?
I think that's exactly right, Mike. I agree with you, and I've agreed with your post on this subject. The SEC really is taking a 20/20 hindsight approach to all of these things. And if you have the internal controls where you caught this issue and you're doing all the things that a company ought to be doing, why is the SEC coming in behind you and say that there's a failure here? It's not a failure. They're working, right? And in particular, in that case I just talked about, these new employees went behind the backs. They understood what the controls were, and they specifically devised a method of evading the internal controls. You know, people are going to be able to do that in every situation. In the companies that have the best and the gold standard compliance program, people are still going to be able to do that. It doesn't mean that those companies don't have adequate internal controls. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I come from a sports background, so I often use sports analogies, and the sports analogy is, looking at the team that wins the Super Bowl, looking at the team that wins the World Series and saying, boy, they had a terrible season, because you know what? They lost a lot of games. In fact, they gave up a lot of home runs. They had a bad season because on that one play, that quarterback threw an interception. Well, if you look in isolation just like that, in terms of one third-party agent or one business transaction, I think that's what we see a lot of times in the SEC realm. And, again, in the abstract it's interesting, but when you pair that with the actual statutory language, I think is where it gets troubling. So back to your carrots and sticks. Clearly, we do have some carrots and sticks to a certain extent in FCPA enforcement. You would like to see a bigger, more juicier carrot. So, please tell our listeners what you would envision there.
All right, so here's my proposal. Let's first of all put certainty into the carrot. All right, essentially, let's do an adequate procedures defense. And the DOJ and SEC could do this on their own. They could institute this program so we don't have to get it passed as legislation as you propose, because, I just don't think that that's going to get done in Congress. It's tough for any individual legislator to vote for something that the other side can characterize as permitting corruption. So here, let the DOJ and SEC agree to do this. It's mandatory. If a company had an anti-corruption compliance program that met industry standards, then it will not be prosecuted nor any enforcement action taken against it, period. No fines, no penalties. And here's a part that I think a limited period of disgorgement. And for disgorgement, I would also argue that it would be offset by investigative costs incurred. So, you're not getting away with anything. Let's see, the basis of disgorgement is that a company should not be able to profit from its wrongdoing. Okay, so a company has a good compliance program. It sees a problem. It corrects it. It hires an outside law firm to come and investigate. It incurs all these costs it would not have incurred but for the issue that they discovered. So it ought to be able to offset the cost, the profits it made, because it has these costs that it has outputted for the outside investigation. And I might feel differently if the disgorgement were going to go to the foreign entity that paid too much for the contract, but it's not going there. It's going into the SEC's pocket. So that's what I would do with disgorgement. And I think there would also have to be a promise that a voluntary disclosure would not trigger additional investigation, so that the company knows that the act of disclosing is not going to cost another arm and leg, right? So they know that this is it. And this, to me, makes a lot of sense, because remember, the company is going to get credit here because it has a good anti-corruption compliance program. And so the presumption, therefore, should be that this program appropriately detected, it may not have prevented, but it detected a violation, and the company is taking appropriate remedial action. There is no reason to test for other countries, other product lines, other businesses, etc. There can, of course, be a normal review to ensure that the investigation was good, but it's a limited review. So that's what I would like to propose, Mike.
Now, the SEC in particular, given what we just talked about in terms of the hindsight-driven nature of FCPA enforcement, it seems, will say, well, you clearly didn't have an FCPA enforcement program that met industry standard because this occurred. So aren't we just taking it? Well,
it goes back to the federal sentencing guidelines, right? What is an effective compliance program? It's to prevent and detect, right? And it's always been that the existence of a violation doesn't mean your compliance program wasn't effective. That's always been the standard.
So for listeners' benefit, you're suggesting that there would be some disgorgement that could be sought by the DOJ or the SEC, but you're saying that disgorgement amount should be reduced by the cost of investigation that the company incurred by investigating itself. If I understand that correctly?
That's correct, because once again, the company has not profited from that violation because it has, to counteract that, it has all these expenses it has outlaid due to its effective compliance program.
And for listeners' benefit, again, in many FCPA cases, not all companies, of course, disclose what I call their pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses. So we know what we know, and to state the obvious, we don't know what we don't know. But what we do know is in the vast majority of FCPA enforcement actions, these pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses significantly, sometimes to the degree of 3, 4, 5 times, exceed the actual settlement amount. So if that is the case, there would, in most all typical FCPA enforcement actions, really be no disgorgement amount per se after the deduction you're suggesting.
That's right. And again, the pros of this approach, Mike, is going to be that you're going to get, and the government's going to get, more companies coming forward to report these violations. You're going to get these disclosures creating investigative leads for other bribery in that country. You're going to get assistance on the kleptocracy initiative by exposing more corrupt officials in foreign countries to potential asset seizures. And it's going to keep the line moving. What do we have now? About 90 or 100 public companies reporting that they're under investigation for FCPA violations, and 3 years to resolve one of these things. If you do what I'm saying, you're going to get more people coming forward. You're going to have shorter time of review. You're going to get more effective compliance in the end, because companies will see that the dollar spent up front on the compliance is really going to be worth something on the back end.
What do you think might be a con of your approach? I mean, as I see it, regulators, DOJ, SEC, law enforcement, they want maximum flexibility. And when you talk about certainty and offering guarantees, I guess one con is that as a practical matter, policy considerations aside that I agree with, one con is I see very little likelihood of the DOJ and the SEC actually agreeing to do this as a matter of internal policy.
So I think you're right that they won't do it. Another con that I see from their perspective, but it doesn't really trouble me, is that they may not be able to go after anyone because the individuals who are responsible are located in a foreign jurisdiction, and it's not likely they're ever going to get personal jurisdiction over them. I think that's probably the primary reason they don't have an amnesty program like the antitrust division, right? Because in a cartel, due to the nature of cartels, the first person in, there's still going to be a target-rich environment to bring criminal actions against the rest of the members of the cartel. In the case of an FCPA violation, if we have a company coming in and reporting a violation and reporting that the responsible people are, let's say, the manager in a subsidiary in China, and that person's never going to come over to the United States, is not a U.S. citizen, they're not going to have anybody to prosecute. And as you said, they might say, look, and if we're not going to get any disgorgement, why are we doing this? And of course, the answer is you're going to be promoting compliance. The whole idea of this thing is to ensure that companies put together an effective anti-corruption compliance program. Because if you put together such a program, you're going to prevent more bribery, and this is a way to really incentivize companies that they spend the resources on the front end, as opposed to sort of crossing their fingers and hoping that they don't get caught. And I think that should be what the whole goal is of the program, as opposed to, making another top 10 list settlement or getting the most number of corporations to sign on to something. Let's promote compliance.
Well, at the risk of sounding a bit provocative, which I tend not to shy away from doing in many cases, is that really what the DOJ is interested in? I completely take your point that from a policy standpoint, that should be the DOJ's number one priority. But when you have an FCPA unit that have increasing resources, increasing enforcement attorneys, when the SEC has an FCPA unit, one of only 5 specialized units at the SEC, if you start to see a decrease in the number of enforcement actions, the civil society, the NGO groups are going to start screaming and say, well, gee, what's going on here? You've got more resources but less enforcement action. Now, I completely take your point that from a policy standpoint, that is what the DOJ and SEC's number one goal should be, but I'm simply saying as a practical matter, is that really what it is?
Well, let's put it in terms of how they talk. Deterrence, right? Isn't it all about deterrence? How can we deter companies from bribing in foreign jurisdictions? And the way you deter that is by increasing compliance programs to prevent the bribery in the first place. So if you can figure out an effective way to get more companies to sign on to do this, it seems to me that that's the approach you ought to take, as opposed to just hitting somebody with a stick repeatedly. Because at some point, people are going to get tired of that. And I think you're still going to have the press releases. You just don't have the enforcement action, if you call it that, to write up. You have something to say, we decline prosecution against this company because they did it all right. And you're going to have more of those. Those 90 on the list right now, you can have 90 a year. And then that gets around the compliance universe, and people say, wow, this dollar spent on compliance is really worth something, because it is tough doing business in these jurisdictions overseas, and somebody's going to mess up. Whether it's a distributor we hire or whether it's an agent we hire, somebody's going to mess up despite our best efforts. And so it's worth spending this money up front.
Well, no less than the current chief of the DOJ's fraud section has stated, albeit prior to when he got this position, that the current FCPA enforcement climate essentially allows the DOJ and the SEC to impose a tax on companies doing business in certain foreign countries. So you would have support, in that statement from our current DOJ fraud section chief, albeit prior to when he joined the unit. One other point I want to raise is the best place to revise FCPA enforcement policies in merely internal DOJ or SEC procedures? Because the problem I see with that is, if that is where the reform is made, at the end of the day, these policies and procedures are articulated by real men and women who frequently float in and out of government service. So there's very little consistency in DOJ internal policies and procedures, whereas when you actually amend a statute, recognizing that amending a law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act will be very difficult, as it always has been throughout FCPA history, are internal policies and procedures the best place to accomplish this reform proposal that you're making?
Mike, I think you're absolutely right. The best place to make it is a change in the statute and put an adequate procedures defense in there. As you pointed out in that article, a dozen countries, OECD countries already have some kind of similar adequate procedures defense written into their laws. But I just can't see it, especially in today's polarized politics, that one candidate says they voted for this kind of thing, and it's going to be, the headline will be, voted to make it easier for a company to bribe, right? At least that's how the person running against them is going to call it. And I think it's going to be very difficult to get that kind of change done. So if all we have to work with is the policies and procedures at DOJ and SEC, we can get that done. They can change that and make it better, I think, a better enforcement program.
Well, you're right as to the practical difficulties. Indeed, some listeners may even term our discussion here as two people talking about, being soft on bribery, two people discussing how are we going to wave the white flag of surrender on the bribery topic, which both you and I know that that's not what we're talking about, but you're absolutely right that sometimes that's how this is perceived. And, it's really interesting, and I guess my final question for you is, it's really interesting that here we are with the FCPA nearly turning 40 years old, and we both seem to be in agreement that there are things we should be doing better here. And you look at 2016, and, there's a good 2.5 months left in 2016 enforcement calendar, is the most active month in FCPA, most active year in FCPA history for FCPA enforcement. Does that suggest a successful statute, or does that suggest actually that the FCPA has failed to achieve its objective of reducing bribery? What are your thoughts on that?
So I don't think it reflects that it has failed to reduce bribery. I think it has reduced bribery. And I think the biggest work that has been done is bringing other countries along, so really bringing the OECD nations along so that they as well see bribery as a bigger issue than just sort of the cost of doing business in a particular country. So I think that the FCPA has been successful, and I should say that the people in the United States government who has gone out by example and made other countries aware of this to change their law, to change their enforcement priorities, to go along to help enforce against this kind of corruption has been a good thing. And I think the kleptocracy initiative is a really valuable program. So I think that the FCPA has been successful, but the question is now, how can we fine-tune that so it's not just a bit about bringing in these huge judgments or penalizing companies that really have good compliance programs? How can we incentivize other companies to get on board to ensure that they know what their responsibilities are and that a compliance dollar is a dollar well spent?
We do want to create a system where you have the best positive incentives put in place so that these situations can be reduced going forward. So I thank you for taking the time today and offering your insights and perspectives and providing for listeners of this podcast your proposal and the reasons why you think the proposal that you articulated will help achieve the laudable objectives of the FCPA. So thanks for taking the time with us today.
And thank you, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity.